We're also waiving certain oil-related sanctions to reduce prices. So we have sanctions on some countries. We're going to take those sanctions off till this straightens out. Then who knows, maybe we won't have to put them on. There'll be so much peace. But when the time comes, the U.S. Navy and its partners will escort tankers through the Strait if needed. I hope it's not going to be needed, but if it's needed, we'll escort them right through.
Hold on. The United States started a war with Iran 10 days ago. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the channel that carries roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. Oil spiked towards $120 a barrel. Global panic set in. Donald Trump's position, his actual solution, was to call Vladimir Putin and lift the sanctions on Russian oil. Let that breathe for a second. The man who said he'd end the Ukraine war in 24 hours, the man that called Russia an adversary, the man who sanctioned Russian oil companies as recently as October 2025, just handed Putin a lifeline because he needed to clean up a mess that he made. Today we're going to trace how we got here, because it didn't start with that phone call and it doesn't end with oil. To understand the deal Trump just handed Putin, you need to know what was in place before. Since 2022, the Western world built a sanctions architecture around Russian oil. A price cap, shipping restrictions, secondary sanctions on buyers. The goal was simple: let Russia sell oil, but only at a price that wouldn't fund the war. It was perfect, it was working. Then Trump came back, and for the first year of his second term, he actually tightened the screws further. In October 2025, the US placed sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, Russia's two largest oil producers. Not a symbolic gesture, a genuine financial strike. He also leaned on India, Russia's biggest remaining customer, imposing 50% tariffs until India reduced its Russian oil purchases. India blinked, purchases dropped. Also a key fact, as of early 2026, the sanctions architecture had reduced Russian oil revenue and reduced its major buyers to look elsewhere. The squeeze was real. The timing of what happened next is everything. Okay, so on the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran, Operation Epic Fury. Secretary of Defense Hexteth stood at the Pentagon podium with a Deutsche Volt tattoo and announced it. Iran's response was predictable. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. Within 48 hours, oil futures were approaching $120 a barrel. South Korea activated a $68 billion market stabilization fund. Japan considered drawing on national reserves. Queues formed at petrol stations in Vietnam, Myanmar, the Philippines. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE were still producing oil, but they couldn't export it. The strait was closed. They started running out of storage space. They began cutting back production because there was nowhere for the oil to go.
I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars. No more wars, no more disruptions. We will have prosperity and we will have peace. Under Trump, we will have no more wars, no more disruptions, and we will have prosperity and peace for all. I am the candidate of peace. I am peace.
Okay, March 9th, 2026, 10 days into the Iran war, Trump calls Putin for about an hour, which is their first publicized call of 2026. Putin's opening position was clear. He'd already said publicly that the US-Israel war in Iran had triggered a global energy crisis. He warned that oil dependent on the Hormuz transport could soon come to a halt. He noted that Russia, the world's second largest oil exporter, was ready to work again with European customers. Let's say that again. Putin had spent the days before the call publicly positioning Russia as the solution to a crisis caused by American foreign policy, and then Trump called him. Immediately after the call, Trump stood at a press conference at Mar-a-Lago and announced he was waiving oil-related sanctions. He didn't name Russia specifically. He didn't have to. The Kremlin's foreign policy aide described the call as very substantial and likely to have practical significance. The Russian energy company stock prices surged. Now here's the question you're probably asking. What on earth would Trump, who sanctioned Russian oil companies just 4 months ago, lift those sanctions now? And why would he do it after calling Putin of all people? The simple answer? Panic. Oil was approaching $120 a barrel. The American consumer was watching fuel prices spike. The midterms are in November. Trump's approval rating was already sliding from the Iran war backlash. He needed oil prices down. He needed them down fast. Russia has spare capacity to move oil. Russia is not dependent on the Strait of Hormuz. Its pipelines go north and east. Russia is the second largest oil exporter in the world. So the cold arithmetic of an oil crisis, Russia is useful. But here is the problem. Lifting sanctions on Russian oil does not just lower prices, it reverses the economic squeeze that was the West's primary leverage over Moscow. It refills the war chest. It tells every Russian soldier in Ukraine that the pressure had just eased. It signals to every country watching, China, Iran, North Korea, that if you create enough chaos, America will eventually need something from you. Let's look at a checklist of what Russia gets. Oil sanctions lifted for the Lukoil and Rosneft, sanctioned back in October 2025 and now able to operate again. Russian energy company stock prices surged immediately. India returned. The US had forced India to cut Russian oil purchases, then gave India emergency permission to buy Russian oil again. The leverage Trump spent months building gone overnight. European return signal. Putin said that Russia is ready to work with European customers. That's an invitation to reverse the pipeline disconnection of 2022. Ukraine leverage reduced. The oil sanctions were one of the West's primary tools for pressuring Russia into meaningful ceasefire terms. Less pressure means less urgency for Moscow to negotiate seriously. Diplomatic rehabilitation. Putin went from international pariah to indispensable partner in the space of a phone call. Trump called it very good. The Kremlin called it substantial. Then there's the Iran war benefit. Russia did not start this war, but Russia benefits from it every day it continues. Higher oil prices even before sanctions lifted, US munitions depleted, European attention divided, American credibility eroding. So let's look at the munitions question. Is America vulnerable? Here is something the press conferences haven't addressed directly. America's missile stockpile is not in good shape, and the Iran war is making that worse in real time. This is not speculation. Before the strikes in Iran, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs warned Trump that a protracted campaign could impact weapons stockpiles, particularly those supporting Israel and the Ukraine. The US has been burning through precision long-range munitions since the Houthi campaign of 2023-2024. Ukraine drew down stockpiles further from 2022, then Israel, now Iran. So we've got the SM-3 interceptors, 414 as of December 2025, up to 55 in June 2025 alone. Production rate cannot replace at a speed that they're being used. You got the THAAD interceptors. America had 534 as of December 2025, up to 30% of the stockpile used in 2025 conflict alone. At sustained conflict consumption, full stockpile exhausted in about 4 or 5 weeks. Patriot missiles. The Pentagon has disputed a Guardian report that the US has 25% of interceptors needed. Hexdef called the stockpile extremely strong. Independent analysts disagree. 5.6 billion. The Pentagon burned through this munitions in the first 2 days of the Iran war. Trump's response, posted on Truth Social that medium-grade stockpiles have never been higher. Acknowledged high-end stockpiles are not where we want to be. Blamed Biden for giving weapons to Ukraine. Here's the strategic implication that nobody is saying clearly on television. If the US is burning through THAAD and SM-3 missiles in Iran, those are the same systems that NATO, Ukraine, Japan and Taiwan depend on for ballistic missile defense. If China is watching, China is counting, every THAAD missile fired at Iranian drone is one fewer deterring Beijing. Let's look at Ukraine and what happens when America looks away. The Ukraine peace process was already fragile. Then the Iran war started. The round of talks scheduled for Abu Dhabi, the one meant to tackle the hardest issues, was postponed the day Washington launched strikes on Tehran. It hasn't been rescheduled. Meanwhile, the ceasefire talks that did happen in Istanbul in Turkey went nowhere. Putin sent what Ukraine called a low-level delegation of non-decision makers. Russia stated conditions remain, regime change in Kiev, limitations on Ukraine's military, no NATO, recognition of occupied territories. These are not negotiated positions, they are demands for surrender. And now Russian sanctions are being eased. Urged World Sanctions campaigner Alexander Kurt put it plainly, easing sanctions on Russia now would throw the Kremlin a rope at the very moment the walls are closing in. Ukrainians will pay for that choice in blood. Okay, so let's look at where this leaves Ukraine. US attention is in the Middle East. US munitions are going to Iran. Russia's war chest has been replenished via oil sanctions relief. Peace talks are stalled. Europe is being told they need to take over, and Trump has said he may back away if progress isn't made, which is exactly what Putin is waiting for. Okay, let's look at Europe. The Council on Foreign Relations, not a radical publication, published an analysis this week with a headline, "When it comes to safeguarding Ukraine, it could now be up to Europe." That headline tells you everything about how things have shifted. France and the UK are already discussing military hubs inside Ukraine. The UK and France have said they will establish protective facilities for weapons and equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs after any ceasefire. But those plans depend on a ceasefire that Russia is not agreeing to. Poland's president said regardless of whether a peace deal is signed or not, despite the best efforts of President Trump, Russia will remain a threat to Europe. That is the front line speaking. They are not reassured. Europe cannot afford to let Ukraine lose. Europe can't replace US military capacity. Europe has been asked to step in as US pivots to the Middle East and potentially to China. And now Russia, Europe's former gas supplier, whose pipelines run under European soil, is being offered back into the energy market by the American president. Putin told European countries he was ready to work with them again. This is not a peace offer. This is leverage. Okay, let's look at the protection pattern. The accusation was Biden will start a war to stay in power. The action was Trump started a war. 6 US soldiers dead, global oil crisis, no exit plan. The accusation, Biden's going to give away our best weapons for nothing, for free, to Ukraine. The action, Trump's Iran war is burning through the same stockpiles, and the Pentagon burned through 5.6 billion munitions in 2 days. The accusation, Russia is an adversary. I'll be tougher on Russia than anybody. The action, Trump called Putin for help, then lifted sanctions on Russian oil. The accusation, I'll end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. The action, peace talks collapsed, Russia stalled, Trump back away. Notice what the pattern does? Every accusation he made against Biden turns out to be a preview of his own actions. Not a warning about Biden, it's a preview of Trump. Okay, so I'm going to look at the useful idiot concept. It describes someone whose actions serve an adversary's interest, regardless of their own intent. They don't have to be working for the other side. They just have to be doing things that make the other side stronger. Okay, let's run the checklist against the last 10 days of American foreign policy. Started a war that closed the most important oil choke points. Check. Created an oil crisis that made Russia indispensable. Check. Lifted sanctions that were the West's main economic lever against Moscow. Check. Diverted US munitions away from Ukraine's defense. Check. Distanced European leadership from Ukraine towards Iran. Check. Delayed Ukrainian peace talks indefinitely. Check. Rehabilitated Putin diplomatically on the world stage. Check. If you were designing a foreign policy to serve Russian interests, you would be hard pressed to do better than this. Now, does that mean Trump is working for Russia? I'm not quite saying that. I don't know that. The useful fool concept doesn't require intent. It requires incompetence, ideology, an ego of fully sufficient. A man who thinks he can win a war, fix oil prices, and make a deal with Putin all in the same week, that man doesn't need to be an agent. He just needs to be in the wrong direction. Next, I'm going to talk about the war economy and who benefits. The Iran war is burning through American munitions at an extraordinary rate. The Pentagon burned through $5.6 billion worth of emissions in the first 2 days. That money doesn't disappear. It goes to defense contractors. It goes to Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, RTX. Those companies' share prices rose as the war started. At the same time, the framework agreement signed in January to quadruple third production over 7 years, that's with Lockheed Martin. The contracts to replace the missiles being fired are worth billions, and the companies building those contracts were already tied to the same political donor networks that funded the campaign of the politicians who are now running the war. That is not a conspiracy theory, that is a budget line. Wars consume weapons, weapons cost money, that money goes somewhere. The question of who benefits financially from sustained conflict is not a fringe question, it's the oldest question in geopolitics. To finish up, let me tell you what you're looking at if you pull back far enough. Russia spent 3 years being squeezed, sanctions, price caps, diplomatic isolation, European customers gone, India customers pressured. The squeeze was working, slowly, imperfectly, but working. Then a decision was made in Washington, a decision that closed the Strait of Hormuz, created a global economic crisis, depleted American munitions, distracted Europe, stalled Ukraine peace talks, and forced the United States to go, cap in hand, to the country it had been squeezing. And the man who made that decision described this call with Putin as very good. Putin's side called it very substantial and said it would have practical significance. Russian energy stocks surged. I'm not going to tell you what to think about that. I've given you the timeline, I've given you the data, I've given you the logic. You can decide what to call it. Incompetence, ideology, ego, something else entirely. What I will tell you is, Russia came out of this 10 days of American foreign policy stronger than it went in, and nobody planned it that way. Or at least, nobody's admitting that they did. If this made you think, share it. If it made you angry, good. Links to all sources cited are in the description. I'm out.